March 19, 1945. 52 miles off the coast of Japan, closer to the enemy homeland than any American carrier had dared approach. Captain Leslie Gerrers stood on the bridge of USS Franklin, watching his flight deck teams prepare 31 aircraft for launch. Bombs hung from wing racks, aviation fuel filled tanks to capacity. Everything was ready for the morning strike against Kobe Harbor. At 7:08, a single Japanese Judy dive bomber materialized from the cloud cover. There was no warning, no radar contact, no time to sound general quarters. The plane came in low and fast, releasing two 550-pound bombs before anyone could react. The first bomb struck the flight deck 15 feet inboard of the island superstructure, punching through the wooden planking, penetrating deck after deck, burrowing 50 feet into the ship's vitals before exploding just above the forward engine room. The second bomb hit aft among the 31 fully fueled, fully armed aircraft waiting to launch. What happened next created an inferno that naval architects had designed against but never truly believed possible. 31 aircraft erupted into flame simultaneously. Their fuel tanks detonated, their bombs cooked off. Tiny TIM rockets ignited and shrieked across the deck like horizontal meteors, cutting through steel bulkheads, starting new fires everywhere they struck. Machine gun ammunition chattered and sparked. The flight deck became a horizontal volcano, spewing flame and debris hundreds of feet into the air. Below decks, the devastation multiplied. 6 compartments simply ceased to exist, vaporized by the initial explosion. Fires erupted across 3 decks spanning 24 frames. The ship's radar was destroyed, her refrigeration system melted. The No. 2 elevator machinery was wrecked, electrical systems disintegrated, hull seams opened, fuel oil tanks ruptured. Franklin took on a 13-degree list to starboard as water poured into her wounded hull. Within minutes, 807 men were dead. Another 800 were wounded or missing. The damage control team, positioned precisely where it needed to be, was obliterated. Water mains snapped, fire curtains shredded. Franklin lay dead in the water, listing, burning, drifting closer to Japan, with every passing moment. From the Japanese perspective, this was exactly how an American carrier was supposed to die. Strike with overwhelming force. Ignite the aviation fuel. Let the secondary explosions do the rest. By every calculation, every precedent, every lesson learned from 3 years of carrier warfare, USS Franklin should have rolled over and sunk within the hour. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Instead, what happened over the next 8 hours would fundamentally alter Japanese naval planners' understanding of American capabilities. Not their firepower, not their radar, not their numbers, but something far more profound and far more terrifying: the ability to save ships that should already be at the bottom of the ocean. 7,200 miles away, in Washington, D.C., Admiral Ernest King received the initial damage reports and made a grim calculation. Franklin was the most heavily damaged American carrier to survive an attack. 724 dead, 265 wounded, massive structural damage, all fire mains knocked out except one gasoline-powered pump, combat information center destroyed, air plot demolished, 59 aircraft obliterated. The Japanese submarine crews in the region began positioning for the kill. Crippled carriers were easy targets. A few torpedoes would finish what the bombs had started. Japanese pilots reported Franklin burning furiously, listing heavily, clearly finished as a fighting unit. Imperial Naval Headquarters updated their tally, another American flat top removed from the board. The mathematics of carrier warfare continued tilting in Japan's favor, but Franklin refused to cooperate with this narrative. Lieutenant Commander Joseph O'Callaghan, the ship's chaplain, organized firefighting parties and led men below to wet down magazines that threatened to explode. Lieutenant Donald Gary discovered 300 men trapped in a blackened mess compartment. He found an exit, returned repeatedly into smoke-filled passageways, and led group after group to safety. Captain Gerrers, despite pressure to abandon ship, flatly refused. "I'll never abandon ship," he snapped at his assistant communications officer, "as long as a single gun will fire." The crew went to work, not with elaborate damage control equipment. Most of that was destroyed. They worked with portable pumps, hand-carried hoses, sheer determination, and 3 years of training that had emphasized one principle above all others. Save the ship, no matter the damage, no matter the cost. Save the ship. The fires burned for 8 hours. Ammunition cooked off continuously. Rockets exploded. Bombs detonated. The flight deck glowed cherry red in places where aluminum from destroyed aircraft had melted and pooled. The heat was so intense that steel buckled. Paint blistered off bulkheads 30 feet from the fires, yet slowly, methodically, Franklin's crew gained the upper hand. They isolated damaged compartments. They rerouted water through undamaged sections. They hand-pumped seawater onto the flames. They jettisoned burning wreckage over the side. They shored up damaged bulkheads with timber. They corrected the list by counter-flooding compartments on the opposite side. By mid-afternoon, the fires were under control. The cruiser USS Santa Fe pulled alongside in a controlled crash, allowing sailors to pass supplies across and evacuate the wounded. 1,200 men transferred off Franklin, but 704 remained. Among them were the engineering crews who descended into the forward engine room, surveyed the damage, and began the impossible task of restarting propulsion. By 1600 hours, 14 hours after the bombs struck, Franklin was making headway under her own power. 5 knots at first, then 10, then 14. The engineering crew nursed damaged boilers, bypassed destroyed systems, and kept the screws turning. Franklin began a 12,000-mile voyage that would take her from the waters off Japan, across the Pacific to Pearl Harbor, through the Panama Canal, and ultimately to the Brooklyn Navy Yard. She steamed under her own power the entire way. Japanese naval intelligence tracked her progress with growing disbelief. The carrier they had written off as destroyed appeared at Ulithi Atoll on March 24th. She departed for Pearl Harbor on April 3rd. She arrived in Hawaii on April 8th. She departed for the Panama Canal on April 12th. Each sighting generated new reports. Each report raised the same impossible question. How was Franklin still afloat? The answer lay not in any single technological innovation, but in a comprehensive philosophy of ship design and damage control that the Imperial Japanese Navy had fundamentally misunderstood. American carriers weren't just floating airfields. They were massive exercises in survivability engineering. Franklin's compartmentalization had contained the flooding. Her redundant systems had allowed partial power recovery. Her damage control doctrine had empowered junior officers to make immediate decisions without waiting for orders from the bridge. Her crew training had emphasized damage control above almost every other skill. Every sailor, regardless of rate or specialty, received extensive training in firefighting, flooding control, and emergency repair procedures. Most critically, American naval architects had designed their carriers with the expectation that they would be hit hard, multiple times. The ships needed to absorb punishment and continue fighting. Every system had backups. Every critical space had multiple access routes. Fire mains could be sectioned off and pressurized independently. Pumps were distributed throughout the ship. Electrical systems had redundant routing. The entire design philosophy presumed battle damage and planned accordingly. Japanese carriers, by contrast, had prioritized offensive capability over defensive resilience. Speed, aircraft capacity, range. These were the metrics that mattered. Damage control was considered important but secondary. The prevailing doctrine assumed Japanese carriers would strike first, strike hard, and eliminate threats before they could counterattack. Superior offense would obviate the need for superior defense. This assumption had been reasonable in December 1941, less so by March 1945. Yet the doctrinal gap remained. Japanese damage control responsibilities were divided between the chief engineering officer for machinery spaces and the officer of the deck for topside damage. Neither received extensive specialized training. Damage control teams were drawn from sailors with other primary duties. Equipment was adequate but not abundant. The emphasis remained on preventing damage rather than recovering from it. Franklin's survival challenged every premise of this philosophy. A carrier subjected to catastrophic damage, suffering casualties that would have overwhelmed most ships' complements, operating 50 miles from enemy territory, with most systems destroyed, should not have survived. Could not have survived under any reasonable assessment of naval architecture and damage control capabilities. Yet she did. When Franklin arrived at the Brooklyn Navy Yard on April 28, Japanese naval attachés in neutral countries obtained photographs through intelligence channels. What they saw confirmed the worst. Franklin's flight deck was a twisted ruin of buckled steel and scorched metal. The island superstructure bore the scars of countless fires. Entire sections of the ship showed damage so severe that reconstruction seemed impossible. Yet here she was, in New York Harbor, under her own power, ready for repairs. The psychological impact on Japanese naval planners was profound. If a carrier this badly damaged could survive, what did that imply about American damage control capabilities more broadly? What about their battleships, their cruisers, their destroyers? How many ships that Japanese forces had reported as sunk, or probably sunk, were actually limping back to Pearl Harbor for repairs? The answer, as it turned out, was disturbing. 3 years earlier, on December 7, 1941, Japanese naval aviation had achieved what appeared to be a devastating victory at Pearl Harbor. 8 battleships struck, 5 sunk outright. USS Arizona completely destroyed after her forward magazines exploded. USS Oklahoma capsized. USS West Virginia, USS California, and USS Nevada sunk in shallow water. 3 more battleships, 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and numerous smaller vessels damaged. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had achieved tactical surprise and inflicted heavy casualties. Over 2,000 Americans killed, nearly 2,000 wounded. The Pacific Fleet's battle line appeared shattered. Japanese planners calculated that American naval strength in the Pacific had been reduced by at least 50%. Those battleships were gone, sunk, destroyed, eliminated from the order of battle for at least 2 years, possibly longer. This assessment was catastrophically wrong. What Japanese intelligence failed to grasp was the significance of where the attack occurred. Pearl Harbor's water depth averaged 40 feet. The ships weren't sunk in the deep ocean. They were resting on the harbor bottom in water shallow enough for salvage operations. Moreover, Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard remained intact. The fuel storage tanks were undamaged. The machine shops were operational. The dry docks were functional. Within days of the attack, Captain Homer Wallin was ordered to lead a formal salvage operation. The task seemed overwhelming. Multiple battleships resting on the bottom, oil-contaminated water everywhere, damaged hulls that needed to be patched underwater, compartments flooded with thousands of tons of seawater, machinery corroded by saltwater immersion. Wallin organized divers from the Navy, from the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard, and from civilian contractors. They began the methodical, dangerous work of salvage. They patched holes, they cleared debris, they pumped water out of compartments, they sealed watertight doors, they worked in confined spaces filled with toxic gases. 2 men died after inhaling poisonous fumes that had accumulated in USS Nevada's interior. Within 6 months, an impossible feat was accomplished. 5 battleships and 2 cruisers were refloated and sent to shipyards for extensive repair. USS Nevada was refloated in February 1942, USS California in March, USS West Virginia in June, the Minelayer Oglala by July. After repairs, these ships returned to combat, not as museum pieces, not as training vessels. They returned as fully operational warships, modernized with improved radar, enhanced anti-aircraft defenses, and updated fire control systems. They were, in many respects, more capable than they had been before the attack. The psychological blow to Japanese naval confidence came in October 1944 at the Battle of Surigao Strait. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's southern force advanced through the strait, intending to attack American landing forces at Leyte Gulf. Waiting for them in the darkness were 6 American battleships arranged in a battle line across the northern exit of the strait. 5 of those 6 battleships had been sunk at Pearl Harbor: USS West Virginia, USS California, USS Tennessee, USS Maryland, USS Pennsylvania. All had been on Battleship Row. All had been struck by Japanese torpedoes and bombs. All had been written off by Japanese intelligence as destroyed or permanently disabled. Now they waited in the darkness, their main batteries loaded with armor-piercing shells, their fire control radars tracking the approaching Japanese vessels with precision that night fighting in 1941 could never have achieved. At 217:03 hours, West Virginia opened fire at a range of 22,800 yards. The other battleships joined within minutes. Nishimura's force was devastated. The battleship Fuso was struck by multiple torpedoes from American destroyers and broke in half. The battleship Yamashiro absorbed hits from West Virginia's 14-inch guns and sank. The heavy cruiser Mogami was crippled and would be finished off by aircraft the next day. Of Nishimura's 7 ships, only 1 destroyer survived. It was the last time in naval history that battleships would engage each other in surface combat, and it was fought primarily with American battleships that the Japanese had already sunk 3 years earlier. The salvage and repair of Pearl Harbor's battleships represented one of history's greatest feats of naval engineering, but it was merely the most visible example of American damage control philosophy in action. The same principles, the same training, the same determination to save damaged ships manifested throughout the Pacific War in ways Japanese planners never anticipated. Consider USS Yorktown during the Battle of Midway. Hit by 3 bombs from Japanese dive bombers on June 4, 1942, Yorktown stayed in the fight through heroic damage control efforts. Her crew extinguished fires. They repaired damaged systems. They corrected her list. Within 2 hours, Yorktown was recovering aircraft again. A subsequent Japanese strike landed 2 torpedo hits, and the crew was finally forced to abandon ship. But Yorktown stayed afloat for 2 more days before finally succumbing to torpedo hits from a Japanese submarine while under tow. By comparison, the 4 Japanese carriers hit during Midway met quick deaths. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu burned uncontrollably and sank. Hiryu lasted slightly longer but ultimately shared their fate. The difference wasn't luck, it was design philosophy and damage control capability. Or consider USS South Dakota during the naval battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942. She absorbed 42 hits from Japanese shells, including one that struck her main battery director. Her superstructure was riddled. Her radar was destroyed. Her communications were knocked out. Yet she remained in action, her engines continued running, and she withdrew from battle under her own power to fight again. Ship after ship demonstrated the same pattern. Damage that should have been fatal merely wounded. Ships that should have sunk limped home. Crews that should have abandoned ship instead saved it. The cumulative effect was mathematical. American ship losses were lower than Japanese planners anticipated. American repair times were faster. American ships returned to combat sooner and in better condition. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Japanese naval officers began noticing the pattern during their own encounters with American damage control. At the Battle off Samar on October 25, 1944, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force engaged the escort carriers of Taffy 3. The American ships were massively outgunned. Kurita's force included 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The American force consisted of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. The escort carriers, nicknamed baby flat-tops, were slow, thinly armored converted merchant hulls never intended for surface combat. Battleships opened fire at 23,000 yards. Colored splashes from Japanese shells began straddling the American formation. USS Kalinin Bay took 15 hits from Japanese main battery guns. One shell passed completely through multiple compartments before exploding just before penetrating the bottom of the ship. Water poured in. The crew fought desperately to stem the flooding, which eventually reached 4 feet deep in some compartments. Yet Kalinin Bay stayed afloat. She kept her engines running. She continued recovering aircraft. 2 kamikaze hits later in the day added to her damage, but still she survived. USS Gambier Bay was less fortunate, sinking under repeated hits, but the other 5 escort carriers of Taffy 3 survived despite taking heavy damage. Japanese officers, accustomed to seeing ships succumb to far less punishment, found this inexplicable. How did thin-skinned escort carriers continue fighting after absorbing multiple heavy-caliber hits? The answer lay in compartmentalization, damage control training, and a crew willing to risk their lives to save their ship. It also lay in design choices American naval architects had made years earlier. Redundant systems, multiple pumps, sectioned fire mains. These weren't glamorous features. They didn't make ships faster or increase their firepower, but they kept ships afloat when they should have sunk. Admiral Kurita, whose force should have annihilated Taffy 3, instead withdrew after 2.5 hours of combat. Multiple factors influenced his decision, but one was the sheer tenacity of American ships that refused to die. His battleships and cruisers had expended thousands of shells, landed dozens of hits, and still the American carriers continued operating. The psychological impact of this resistance, combined with misidentification of escort carriers as fleet carriers, contributed to Kurita's decision to abandon his attack on the Leyte beachhead. The pattern repeated throughout the Okinawa campaign. USS Laffey, a destroyer on radar picket duty, was attacked by 22 kamikaze aircraft on April 16, 1945. Over 80 minutes, 6 kamikaze strikes and 4 bomb hits devastated the ship. 1 bomb jammed her rudder, forcing Laffey to steam in circles. Her aft gun mounts were destroyed, fires raged, yet her crew kept fighting. They manned guns under fire, they battled flames, they made emergency repairs while under attack. Laffey survived, 32 dead and 71 wounded, but the ship stayed afloat. She was towed to anchorage, received temporary repairs, and eventually steamed back to the United States for reconstruction. The Japanese pilots who attacked her believed they had sunk her. Their reports indicated a destroyer struck by multiple kamikazes and bombs, clearly destroyed. Yet weeks later, American intelligence intercepts mentioned USS Laffey's survival, prompting confusion among Japanese naval staff. This confusion intensified as the war continued. Japanese forces were sinking American ships, or so they believed. Yet those same ships kept appearing in combat. Damaged vessels that should have required months of repair were back in action within weeks. Ships reported as sunk turned up in later battles. The cumulative psychological impact was devastating. Japanese naval officers began questioning their own damage assessments. Had their pilots been wrong? Were American ships somehow more resilient than anticipated? What technology or technique were the Americans using to keep damaged ships operational? The truth was simpler and more profound than any secret technology. American damage control was a complete system encompassing ship design, crew training, equipment distribution, and operational doctrine. Every element reinforced every other element. The result was that American ships could absorb punishment that would sink equivalent Japanese vessels. This capability gap manifested in stark statistics. Of 21 American warships hit by kamikazes in the last year of the war, all were saved from sinking by damage control work. Some were ruled constructive total losses, too damaged for economical repair. But they didn't sink. Crews got them to safe anchorages. Salvage teams assessed them. Some were scrapped, some were used as targets. One was towed into the combat zone as a decoy. But they didn't sink in battle. Japanese ships hit by equivalent damage typically sank quickly. The difference wasn't hull strength or armor thickness. It was damage control capability and the will to save the ship regardless of cost. The realization came gradually to Japanese naval leadership, not through any single dramatic moment, but through accumulated evidence that refused to fit their understanding of naval warfare. Reports from pilots claiming certain kills on American carriers, that later appeared in reconnaissance photographs. Intelligence intercepts mentioning ships supposedly sunk months earlier, prisoners of war describing damage control procedures that seemed impossibly elaborate. Each piece of evidence added to a growing, uncomfortable conclusion. The Americans had solved a problem Japanese naval architects believed unsolvable. They had created ships that refused to die. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had commanded the carrier strike force at Pearl Harbor, never lived to see the full implications of his tactical victory's strategic failure. He died by suicide on Saipan in July 1944 as American forces overran the island. But in the months before his death, he had witnessed American carrier task forces operating with a confidence and resilience that troubled him deeply. American carriers absorbed damage and continued operating. When hit, they didn't burn uncontrollably like Akagi or Kaga had at Midway. Their fires were contained. Their flooding was controlled. Their crews fought to save the ship with a determination that seemed almost irrational. Japanese doctrine emphasized saving face and dying honorably. American doctrine emphasized saving the ship and living to fight again. This philosophical difference manifested in training priorities. Japanese damage control teams received adequate instruction, but damage control was considered a secondary specialty. Primary focus remained on offensive operations. Gunnery, navigation, torpedo attacks, air operations. These were the skills that won battles. Damage control was something you dealt with after being hit. American training inverted these priorities. Every sailor, regardless of specialty, spent significant time training for damage control, firefighting, flooding control, emergency repairs, chemical, biological, and radiological defense. Damage control wasn't an afterthought. It was foundational. The assumption was that every ship would be hit eventually. When that happened, the crew's response in the first minutes would determine whether the ship survived or sank. This training emphasis produced crews who reacted instinctively when damage occurred. No need to wait for orders. No confusion about responsibilities. Every sailor knew their damage control station. They knew which equipment to use. They knew which compartments to seal. They knew how to fight fires, control flooding, and maintain stability. This decentralized decision-making allowed American damage control to function even when communications were knocked out and command structure was disrupted. Japanese damage control, by contrast, relied on centralized direction. The officer of the deck coordinated topside response. The chief engineering officer managed machinery space damage. This division of responsibility created gaps. Topside officers might not understand engineering implications. Engineering officers might not grasp topside tactical requirements. Coordination between these two authorities consumed precious time, while fires spread and flooding increased. Moreover, Japanese damage control equipment was less abundant and less well distributed than American equivalents. American ships carried multiple portable pumps of varying capacities. The handy billy pumps, weighing 160 pounds, could be manhandled anywhere on the ship. The larger 500-pound mobile pumps, powered by gasoline engines, provided enormous capacity for major flooding. Hoses and couplings were standardized across the fleet, allowing equipment from one ship to be used on another. Japanese ships carried adequate pumps and hoses, but not in the same abundance. When damage destroyed primary fire mains, fewer backup options existed. When portable pumps were lost to battle damage, replacements might not be available. The industrial capacity to produce damage control equipment in vast quantities simply didn't exist in the same way it did for the United States. This industrial disparity extended to every aspect of naval operations. American shipyards on both coasts operated at capacity throughout the war. Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California, Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in Washington, Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard in Hawaii, Philadelphia Naval Shipyard in Pennsylvania, Norfolk Naval Shipyard in Virginia, Brooklyn Navy Yard in New York. Each facility possessed extensive repair capabilities, abundant materials, and skilled workers in vast numbers. When a damaged American ship arrived at a major naval yard, repair work began immediately. Damaged hull plates were cut out and replaced. Machinery was overhauled or replaced entirely. Electrical systems were rebuilt. Weapons were upgraded. Radar was installed or improved. The ship that emerged from repair was often more capable than before being damaged. Modernizations that would have required extended peacetime refit were incorporated during battle damage repairs. Japanese shipyard capacity, while substantial, couldn't match this scale. Kure Naval Arsenal in Hiroshima Prefecture was Japan's largest naval shipyard. Yokosuka Naval Arsenal near Tokyo possessed extensive facilities. Sasebo Naval Arsenal in Nagasaki Prefecture handled major repairs, but these facilities faced constant material shortages. Steel was scarce, copper was rationed, electronics components were limited. Skilled workers were increasingly drafted into military service. A Japanese ship damaged in combat might wait weeks for repair to begin simply because necessary materials weren't available. When repairs did commence, they often took longer than equivalent American work due to parts shortages and improvised solutions. The ship that emerged might be operational again, but rarely better than before damage. Modernizations were deferred. Upgrades were postponed. The goal was to return the ship to service, not to improve it. This industrial asymmetry manifested throughout the naval war. American destroyers damaged at Guadalcanal received repairs at Espiritu Santo or Noumea within weeks. Japanese destroyers damaged in the same battles might wait months for proper repairs at Truk or Rabaul. American submarines with battle damage put into Pearl Harbor or Brisbane and were back on patrol within a month. Japanese submarines requiring major repairs might be out of service for 3 months or longer. The cumulative effect was mathematical. American ships spent more time in combat and less time in repair. Japanese ships spent more time under repair and less time in combat. Over months and years, this time differential multiplied. The American advantage in ship numbers was real, but the advantage in ship availability was even greater. Captain Tamechi Hara, commanding officer of the destroyer Shigure and one of the few Japanese destroyer captains to survive the entire war, later wrote about his growing awareness of American damage control superiority. Shigure participated in numerous battles, including the naval Battle of Guadalcanal, the Battle of Vella Gulf, and the Battle of Surigao Strait. In each engagement, Hara witnessed American ships absorbing damage that would have sunk Japanese vessels. During the naval Battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942, Shigure engaged American cruisers and destroyers in a chaotic night action. Hara watched American ships take hits that should have knocked them out of action, yet they continued fighting. Their guns kept firing. Their engines kept running. Even badly damaged American ships maintained formation and continued engaging Japanese forces. By contrast, Japanese ships hit by similar damage often fell out of formation and struggled to maintain way. Fires burned longer. Flooding proved harder to control. Ships that should have remained combat effective became stragglers requiring escort back to base. Hara noted this pattern but initially attributed it to bad luck or inferior crews. Only gradually did he recognize a systemic difference in damage control capability. The Battle of Surigao Strait in October 1944 provided Hara with definitive evidence. Shigure was the only Japanese ship to escape the strait with minor damage. Hara watched the battleships Fuso and Yamashiro absorbed dozens of hits from American battleships and sink rapidly. The heavy cruiser Mogami was crippled by American gunfire. 3 destroyers were sunk by torpedo and gunfire. What struck Hara was not just the overwhelming American firepower, but how quickly Japanese ships succumbed to damage. Fuso broke in half after torpedo hits and magazine explosions. Yamashiro capsized and sank after absorbing multiple heavy-caliber hits. These were not small ships. Fuso and Yamashiro were 30,000-ton battleships with substantial armor protection. Yet once breached, their damage control proved inadequate to save them. Hara later interviewed survivors from Mogami and learned details that disturbed him. When Mogami's bridge was hit, communications throughout the ship were disrupted. Damage control parties struggled to coordinate. Fire mains were broken and couldn't be not bypassed efficiently. Portable pumps were insufficient for the scale of flooding. The crew fought bravely, but they lacked the equipment, training, and procedures to save a heavily damaged ship. Hara contrasted this with American ships he'd observed during the war. USS San Francisco, after the naval Battle of Guadalcanal, her bridge shot away, multiple fires burning, yet she withdrew under her own power. USS South Dakota, after absorbing 42 hits during the same battle, damaged but operational. USS Minneapolis, with her bow blown off by Japanese torpedoes, managing to steam backward to Tulagi Harbor. USS New Orleans, similarly with her bow destroyed, sailing stern first to safety. American ships, Hara concluded, possessed some combination of design characteristics, equipment distribution, and crew training that allowed them to survive damage that would sink Japanese vessels. This wasn't a small advantage, it was fundamental. It meant American ships could take risks Japanese ships couldn't. It meant American tactical doctrine could be more aggressive because ships could recover from mistakes. It meant the mathematics of attrition warfare favored the Americans even more than raw production numbers suggested. This realization spread through the Japanese Naval Officer Corps during the final year of the war. Submarine commanders reported American destroyers surviving depth charge attacks that should have crushed their pressure hulls. Japanese submarines with equivalent damage sank. Surface ship captains reported American cruisers absorbing torpedo hits and remaining in action. Japanese cruisers with similar damage had to be scuttled. The kamikaze campaigns that began in October 1944 provided the most extensive evidence of American damage control superiority. Kamikaze attacks were, in theory, unstoppable. An aircraft loaded with explosives and fuel, piloted by someone willing to die, striking a ship with kinetic energy and explosive force that no armor could completely defeat. The tactic was born of desperation, but it possessed genuine tactical merit. One aircraft, one pilot, could potentially sink a carrier or cruiser that might otherwise survive conventional bombing. Yet the kamikaze results proved disappointing from the Japanese perspective. Yes, kamikazes sank ships. USS Streetlow, an escort carrier, was sunk by kamikaze attack during the Battle off Samar. USS Princeton was eventually scuttled after being crippled by a conventional bombing attack. Multiple destroyers were sunk by kamikaze strikes. The human cost to American forces was severe. Nearly 5,000 American sailors died from kamikaze attacks, and many more were wounded, but the ships kept fighting. USS Bunker Hill was hit by 2 kamikazes on May 11, 1945. The attacks killed 396 men and wounded 264. Fires raged across her flight deck. Explosions tore through her hangar bays. Yet Bunker Hill's crew contained the damage, controlled the fires, and saved the ship. She was towed to safety and later sailed to the United States for repairs under her own power. USS Enterprise was hit by a kamikaze on May 14, 1945. The attack penetrated the flight deck and exploded inside the ship, causing extensive damage. 14 men died and 34 were wounded. Within minutes, damage control parties had the fires under control. Within an hour, Enterprise was recovering aircraft again. She remained on station supporting Okinawa operations. USS Intrepid earned the nickname the Evil Eye among kamikaze pilots because she kept surviving their attacks. She was hit by kamikazes on November 25, 1944, then again on April 16, 1945. Each time, her crew controlled the damage and kept her operational. After the second kamikaze hit at Okinawa, Intrepid remained on station for several more days before withdrawing for repairs. She returned to combat before the war ended. The pattern was consistent. Kamikazes inflicted terrible damage and killed hundreds of sailors. But they didn't sink many ships. Of the hundreds of kamikaze attacks during the Okinawa campaign, 36 American ships were sunk. Against this, 368 ships were damaged but saved. The ratio was nearly 10-1 in favor of ships surviving. Japanese naval planners had anticipated different mathematics. If kamikazes could achieve a 1-to-1 ratio, one aircraft sinking one ship, the tactic would devastate American invasion fleets. Even a 2-to-1 ratio, two aircraft required to sink one ship, would inflict unsustainable losses. But a 10-to-1 ratio, 10 aircraft damaging one ship that survived anyway, was strategic failure despite tactical success. The explanation lay in American damage control. Ships hit by kamikazes didn't automatically sink. They caught fire, yes. They suffered hull breaches, yes. They took casualties, absolutely. But their crews fought to save them with equipment and training that Japanese forces couldn't match. Fire parties attacked flames immediately. Damage control parties sealed breaches rapidly. Medical personnel treated casualties efficiently. Engineers maintained propulsion even with extensive damage. The entire ship's company focused on survival, and more often than not, they succeeded. Japanese kamikaze pilots reported sinking ships that later appeared in American order of battle listings. The disconnect between pilot reports and actual results created confusion at Imperial Naval Headquarters. Were pilots overestimating their effectiveness? Were Americans hiding their losses? Or were American ships surviving damage that should be fatal? The third possibility, once accepted, had profound implications. It meant kamikaze attacks needed to be more intense to achieve the same results. It meant conventional bombing was even less effective than previously estimated. It meant the mathematics of attrition warfare were worse than the most pessimistic Japanese calculations. It meant America's industrial advantage was compounded by a damage control advantage that couldn't be quickly replicated. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, commander of the 5th Air Fleet and coordinator of kamikaze operations, recorded his growing frustration in his diary during the Okinawa campaign. Pilots reported hits, pilots described ships burning and exploding, yet reconnaissance photos showed those same ships still operational days later. American carrier task forces that should have been depleted by cumulative damage continued operating at full strength. Ugaki concluded that American damage control must be extraordinarily effective, but he had no clear understanding of how it worked or how to counter it. Japanese doctrine had never emphasized attacking damaged ships. The warrior code considered finishing off cripples less honorable than seeking fresh combat. This cultural bias, combined with operational realities that made locating individual damaged ships difficult, meant American vessels hit by kamikazes were rarely subject to follow-up attacks. Had Japanese forces adopted a doctrine of persistent attack on damaged ships, American damage control might have been overwhelmed, but such attacks would have required reconnaissance assets, coordination between air units, and willingness to expend multiple aircraft on single targets. Japanese forces, stretched thin across vast distances and facing constant American air superiority, couldn't implement this doctrine effectively. The result was that American ships hit by kamikazes had time to implement damage control procedures, time to fight fires, time to control flooding, time to stabilize the ship, time to evacuate wounded, time to make temporary repairs. This time differential between being hit and being finished off proved crucial. American damage control doctrine was built around buying time. If the crew could survive the first hour, they could usually save the ship. If they could save the ship for the first day, they could usually get it to safe anchorage. If they could get it to safe anchorage, Pearl Harbor or Ulithi or Leyte, repair facilities could restore combat capability. This cycle of damage, control, repair, and return frustrated Japanese strategic planning. The American fleet that Japanese forces damaged in April would return to combat in June. Ships written off as destroyed reappeared in intelligence reports. The unending cycle of American regeneration contrasted sharply with Japanese experience. Japanese ships damaged in April might not return to service for 6 months, if ever. The industrial capacity that enabled American damage control extended beyond shipyards. Medical facilities treated wounded sailors and returned them to duty. Training commands replaced casualties with fresh personnel. Supply depots provided replacement equipment. The entire system supported ships staying in combat and surviving damage. Japanese logistics couldn't match this support system. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. Replacement personnel were scarce. Equipment was rationed. Ships were expected to avoid damage rather than survive it. This defensive mindset, while understandable given resource constraints, created a psychological disadvantage. Japanese crews knew damaged ships might not be savable. American crews knew every damaged ship could potentially be saved. This psychological dimension proved as important as material factors. American sailors fought to save their ships because they believed it possible. They'd seen other damaged ships survive. They'd heard stories of crews accomplishing impossible repairs. They'd trained for scenarios where everything went wrong and learned techniques for recovering anyway. This confidence translated into action under fire. When their ship was hit, they reacted with practiced efficiency rather than panic. Japanese sailors fought bravely, but they lacked the time, same confidence in damage control. They'd seen ships sink rapidly after being hit. They'd heard stories of inadequate equipment and insufficient time. Their training emphasized preventing damage rather than recovering from it. When their ship was badly hit, the psychological question became not, "Can we save her?" but "How long until we have to abandon?" This psychological difference manifested in survival rates. American ships with severe damage often kept 50% or more of their crew aboard to continue damage control efforts. Japanese ships with similar damage might lose most of their crew to early abandonment. The remaining damage control parties were thus smaller and less capable of managing extensive damage. Captain Hara of Shigure survived the war and later wrote extensively about Japanese naval operations. In his post-war reflections, he emphasized the damage control disparity as one of Japan's critical disadvantages. Superior American damage control, he argued, multiplied the effectiveness of American industrial production. It wasn't enough for Japan to build ships at competitive rates. Those ships also needed to survive combat at competitive rates. They didn't. Other surviving Japanese naval officers reached similar conclusions. Commander Haruki Iki, who served aboard multiple cruisers during the war, described American damage control as almost supernatural in its effectiveness. He'd witnessed American cruisers absorb damage that would have sunk Japanese cruisers, yet they continued fighting. The technical and organizational methods behind this capability remained mysterious to him throughout the war. After Japan's surrender, American occupation forces provided some illumination. Japanese naval officers were given tours of American ships. They observed damage control equipment distribution. They reviewed training materials. They interviewed American damage control personnel. What they learned confirmed their suspicions but also surprised them with its comprehensiveness. American damage control wasn't a single innovation. It was a complete system encompassing ship design, equipment production, crew training, operational doctrine, industrial support, and psychological preparation. Every element reinforced every other. Remove any single element and the system degraded but didn't fail. This redundancy and integration was characteristically American. Not elegant, not minimal, but robust and effective. Japanese naval architects had believed they understood American ship design. American vessels were well built, certainly. They incorporated good engineering principles, but Japanese ships were also well designed, in some respects superior. Japanese cruisers were faster. Japanese torpedoes were more powerful. Japanese optical rangefinders were better. In various technical parameters, Japanese equipment matched or exceeded American equivalents. What Japanese architects hadn't fully grasped was that American design philosophy prioritized survivability over maximum performance. An American cruiser might be slightly slower than a Japanese cruiser, but it would survive damage better. An American torpedo might have slightly less range than a Japanese long lance, but American fire control systems were more reliable and easier to repair. American radar might not be the most advanced possible, but it was standardized and mass-produced with abundant spare parts. These trade-offs made sense within American operational doctrine, but they seemed wasteful from Japanese perspective. Why build ships with excess capacity when that capacity could be used for better performance? Why standardize when custom optimization could squeeze out additional capability? Why focus on repair and damage control when avoiding damage through superior speed and firepower was more elegant? The answer, evident by 1945, was that war is attrition. Ships will be damaged. Equipment will fail. Crews will make mistakes. The military that plans for these inevitabilities, rather than hoping to avoid them, will prevail over time. American military planning embraced this reality. Japanese planning, influenced by cultural preferences for decisive battle and honorable victory, never fully internalized it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The story of how Japanese admirals came to realize American damage control superiority is ultimately a story about different philosophies of warfare colliding. Japan emphasized offensive action, technical excellence, and warrior spirit. America emphasized industrial capacity, systematic preparation, and pragmatic problem-solving. Both approaches had merit, but in the specific context of Pacific naval warfare, 1941 to 1945, the American approach proved superior. The battleships salvaged from Pearl Harbor, the carriers that survived catastrophic damage, the destroyers that absorbed kamikaze hits and kept fighting. Each instance represented not just American technical capability, but American willingness to invest enormous resources in damage control, repair, and recovery. This investment paid strategic dividends that Japanese planners never anticipated. When USS Franklin steamed into New York Harbor in April 1945, having survived damage that should have sunk her, she became a symbol of American damage control effectiveness. When Pearl Harbor's salvaged battleships crossed the T at Surigao Strait, they validated American investment in salvage and repair. When USS Laffey survived 22 kamikaze attacks, she demonstrated American training and determination. These weren't isolated incidents. They were manifestations of systematic American advantages in damage control, ship design, industrial support, and crew training. Japanese admirals, encountering these advantages throughout the war, gradually realized they'd underestimated a critical dimension of naval capability. The war ended in August 1945 with Japan's surrender. Among the factors that led to this outcome, American damage control capability ranked high on lists compiled by post-war Japanese analysts: ships that refused to sink, fleets that regenerated faster than attrition could reduce them, industrial systems that supported damaged vessels until they could return to combat. These advantages, less visible than carrier air power or submarine warfare, nonetheless contributed decisively to American victory. The legacy of this disparity continued into post-war naval architecture. Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force ships, built in the 1950s and beyond, incorporated American damage control principles: distributed pumps, sectioned fire mains, comprehensive crew training. The lessons learned through defeat shaped Japanese naval development for generations. American naval forces, having proven damage control effectiveness in World War II, continued emphasizing these capabilities. The Damage Controlman rating, established in 1948, professionalized damage control beyond the wartime system. Modern American warships incorporate even more sophisticated damage control systems, building on principles validated in the Pacific War. The story resonates beyond naval history. It illustrates how systematic preparation for adverse circumstances can prove decisive. It demonstrates that capability advantages span multiple dimensions beyond raw firepower. It shows that cultural assumptions about warfare can blind military forces to critical vulnerabilities. Japanese admirals never imagined American damage control could save ships they'd already sunk. This failure of imagination cost Japan dearly. Ships Japanese forces destroyed returned to battle. Fleets Japanese intelligence counted as depleted remained operational. The American Pacific Fleet, badly hurt at Pearl Harbor, regenerated to become an overwhelming force that Japanese naval power couldn't match. The salvaged battleships of Pearl Harbor, fighting at Surigao Strait, the burning wreck of USS Franklin, steaming to New York under her own power, the battered hull of USS Laffey, surviving attacks that should have annihilated her. These ships told a story Japanese admirals learned too late. In naval warfare, killing ships requires more than hitting them. It requires hitting them so hard, or so repeatedly, that damage control cannot save them. American damage control made that threshold nearly unreachable, and in making it unreachable, American damage control contributed as much to Pacific victory as any carrier strike, any submarine patrol, any amphibious assault. The ships that wouldn't die became the fleet that couldn't be defeated, and that made all the difference. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.